Hi, I'm Sam Gruber for CSP, and welcome to another journey to one of my favorite Jewish buildings, places, or spaces. We've been in Europe for the last few trips, and I'm taking you back to America. And we looked at one earlier synagogue, an Orthodox synagogue from the early 20th century, early in the series. Now we're going to look at a much more recent building, one of my favorite modern structures in America, the great North Shore Congregation Israel building by Minoru Yamasaki in Glencoe, Illinois. So join me, and I think you'll enjoy this. And it will be a little different and maybe a little refreshing, awesome, exciting, perhaps bewildering for a few of you. North Shore Congregation Israel is one of the most remarkable modern synagogues in America. It's also one of the best known because it's so photogenic. This picture by my friend and colleague Paul Rochelle was taken almost 20 years ago, and the building got pride of place in a book I published back then called American Synagogues, A Century of Architecture and Jewish Community, for which Paul did beautiful photographic work. It was the publisher's decision to put the interior of North Shore on the cover, but it's very fitting because it is one of the iconic synagogues of the century, of the 20th century. You may know the architect Minoru Yamasaki more from his World Trade Center building, which stood in New York just until about the time of the publication of this book, when of course they were terribly destroyed on the attacks of 9/11. But Minoru Yamasaki is known for many other, and I think better buildings, including this synagogue. More recently, last year, a big book came out called Marvels of Judaism Synagogues, also published by Rizzoli, which I had the pleasure of writing one chapter for. And again, I was able to express my delight at this building and its architecture. So you can find it in many places, and probably along with Frank Lloyd Wright's Beth Shalom and Elkins Park, it is the most reproduced, but perhaps least visited, important modern synagogue of its age. It was designed intentionally to be so well known. It was not meant to be a humble, modest building. Rabbi Siskin, who presided over this congregation in the 1950s and 60s, wanted something that would be remarkable, and he wanted an architect who could carry out a new modern vision that would present a new idea for the congregation and revitalize it and educate it. But he also wanted a building that would make its mark on the Jewish and broader American cultural landscape. Siskin was a remarkable man. He not only was he a rabbi, but he was an anthropologist, and he was deeply involved with many contemporary American cultural issues, including in the arts. So he was attuned to the changes in post-World War II America, in which modernism was really superseding all of the historicist styles in architecture, in sculpture, and painting. And he was fully willing to embrace that for his new adventure, for North Shore Congregation Israel. He had a large vision. I'm quoting, he had a large vision for this new building. These are from the building committee notes, in which they summarize his statements. It should be the most beautiful in our capacity to build, and one that is a landmark in religious architecture, a real contribution to Jewish structures. To do that, he and his colleague, Henry Goldstein, who was the executive director of the temple, launched an ambitious building program, which they put together a dedicated committee that began to define what they wanted, but also began to visit synagogues, new synagogues across the country, and to interview many of the leading architects of America at that time, leading modernists. And the list that they compiled is really quite quite impressive, significant in that it really includes what we would call the star architects today, the star architects of the country, but not so much many of the better known Jewish architects who were engaged in active synagogue architecture in the post-World War II decades. There was a very competent firm associated with the temple already, Friedman, Altschuler, and Sincere, and they were dubbed the local architects of record at an early phase. But it was decided by the board that no local Chicago architect would be hired to be the design architect. And this was done partly apparently to avoid conflict within the congregation, because it seems that many Chicago architects were actually members of North Shore, and it would be too hard to choose. But the Altschuler family had a long association with the temple, which we'll discuss later, and therefore it was fitting that that firm should at least be the local coordinators, and they would be handling most of the Jewish function, shall we say, in designing the sanctuary and what was planned at that time to be additional buildings, while the star design architect would be coming up with a new concept and breaking the box, so to speak, to come up with something new. We're lucky that we have very good records of this whole planning process, and I'm very indebted to the congregation, including their archivist, for making these documents available to me in recent years so that I could continue my research in understanding this important structure. So, of course, they were aware of works like Frank Lloyd Wright's Beth Shalom, which was still just being completed when they were just beginning their project. And they went and visited the site, and they would have seen this giant tent, and that would have impressed them. And it may have given them some ideas for what they wanted, a kind of tabernacle, if you will, or a tent of Jacob in the wilderness. Maybe they'd help produce the concept, but they looked at many other synagogues too, and they engaged investigation of these leading lights. This is just a list. I can't show you all of their buildings, but all of them were noteworthy. There are some interesting inclusions on this list. Paul Williams, who they describe as a Negro architect with offices on the West Coast. Paul Williams was at the time the leading African-American architect in the country, and it's just noticeable that he made the list. Philip Johnson, the great star of the international style, has done many synagogues. In fact, he'd only done one synagogue, and it was based on an earlier design for a church, so it wasn't entirely an informed list. Pietro Belushi, they call him Pietra, and he was the dean of MIT at the time, and he was engaged in synagogue design in Rochester. Morris Lapidus, who's known for the Fontainebleau Hotel in Florida, but also designed several synagogues, and many others. Only a few on this list: Max Abramowitz from Harrison and Abramowitz, Marcel Breuer, and Morris Lapidus, and one or two others were Jewish. Most of the others were not. Pereira from Seattle, also a Jewish architect. They really liked Eero Saarinen, and they had long discussions and negotiations with him. He was riding high after the completion, the design and completion. It was completed in 1961 of the TWA terminal at Kennedy Airport, very expressive. And you can see some of his other buildings. And obviously, if they were going to go with Saarinen, they were going to be going in an entirely new direction. As it happened, Saarinen died, I think, around in the early 60s. So he would not have lived to have seen the completion of this project. So in a sense, the committee was spared that problem. This is also Saarinen, and it begins to suggest some of the appeal of the architect they would eventually choose, Minoru Yamasaki. They looked at Kivet and Myers in Kansas City, who who were just working on this big building, Bnei Yehuda, which unfortunately was torn down in the early 2000s, but you can see it's kind of a space age design and very unusual, and would have appealed to Rabbi Siskin. They also talked to Marcel Breuer, who was teaching at Harvard at the time. He was a refugee from Germany and had made a mark at the Bauhaus in Germany before the war. He favored heavy use of concrete, and some of his spaces are really just so overwhelming that they make the space in the Yamasaki building at North Shore that was finally completed, though it's often described as being overwhelming. A Yamasaki space actually looks downright intimate compared to some of the work of Breuer. Pietro Belluschi they liked a lot. He was at MIT, but he didn't have the time. He was too busy, but he offered to advise or look over any designs that came their way. And this is the work in Rochester that he was building at the same time that was completed around 1963, a year before North Shore. In the end, though, they chose an architect they fell in love with, Minoru Yamasaki from Detroit. He had offices in Detroit. He was originally from the West Coast. He was of Japanese ancestry, but born in America. But he was widely traveled, and he built in Japan. He traveled in Asia. He knew European architecture. He was steeped in architectural history, but he was also technologically very innovative. And they just, the committee just, in Jewish terms, they cavelled over him. They just fell in love with Yamasaki, and he was very eager to do the work. And he engaged with the committee. He invited them to his offices in Detroit. They toured some of his other buildings, and it was a love affair that continued throughout the project, even though it took much longer than planned and there were considerable cost overruns. Yamasaki delivered, and the committee overall was very happy with working with him. At that time, he was riding high because of the fame of the Lampert Airport Terminal in St. Louis, which you see here, and you can already see there's a similarity in the thin concrete shell and the way you have a modular system of vaults, and this probably spoke to the committee, and in some ways it is translated into the North Shore design. Here's a color view of it, and compared with the final result at North Shore, you can see there is a general similarity, which we'll discuss in more detail. Now, North Shore has been called a cathedral synagogue. There is no such thing as a cathedral synagogue. Cathedrals are come out of the Christian tradition. Cathedra means the seat. It's the seat, the physical chair that a bishop sits in, and so it's the church of a bishop. Often very grand because it's the most important church in any town. But in the 19th century, Jews began building big synagogues, and this was partly because they wanted to express their arrival as now civic, political, economic equals and participants in European and American society, but also they were pressured by their Christian neighbors to build according to their status, to build synagogues that would be comparable to churches in appearance. The best known example of this is Temple Emmanuel in New York on Fifth Avenue at 60th Street. And it was the last big building erected before the Depression. It actually was finished in early 1930. So if there's one building we might call a cathedral synagogue in America, without question, and that would be Temple Emmanuel. Glencoe is very different. It's big, but it's not urban. It's suburban, and it's freestanding, and it only in its size and elegance and sort of modular, repetitive form that recalls medieval architecture, does it really deserve that name? And here's a real cathedral. This is Chartres Cathedral, which also fundamentally different from North Shore. But I've also heard North Shore described in other terms as something very natural, organic. It's been described as a sort of a whale skeleton washed up on the beach. So I was happy to find this wonderful photograph from online of a whale skeleton, and there is a sort of similarity. The crisp whiteness in the sun, the repetition of the ribs and the vaults, similar to the ribs of the whale. But there's also other natural forms that you can see in the building, and these are come out of flowers, like the calla lily that you see here in the lower left of this slide, and compare that to these corners of the building that sort of grow up like the petals of the flower, and then blossom when they get to the top and spread their petals. So there's a combination. So Yamasaki was influenced by nature, he was influenced by history, and he got a very intense Jewish history too from Rabbi Siskin. He had never designed a religious building before, and he was a little wary, but he was eager in taking on the task. And so he immersed himself in Jewish lore. And while he never describes the North Shore synagogue as a tabernacle, as a mishkan, that was my first impression of the building when I visited it more than 20 years ago for the first time. And the mishkan, of course, was the temporary tabernacle erected by the Jews, when they left Egypt. And there's a fence or a kind of a wall, temporary wall around the Holy of Holies in the center. And it's this modular fence or wall that's described in great detail in the book of Exodus that has inspired many, many attempts at reconstructing the tabernacle. And we see here on the right a view by a rabbi, a 17th century rabbi, Jacob Judah Leon, whose print then was very influential for both Jewish and Christian architects going forward. So the tabernacle has played a fundamental role in shaping synagogue design for many centuries. So now we're looking inside, and Yamasaki wrote about the building in some general terms. I had not designed a large religious structure before, and therefore was very interested in the challenge presented by this building. He attended high holiday services, which he found inspiring, and it gave him a clear understanding. Perhaps he should have attended some Shabbat services as well when there are not as many people attending, but he attended high holiday services, and he really conceived of a very grand space needed to enclose and support a large, the full congregation that turns up those few days of the year. Take a good look at this view. You see that it's segmental. These are cast concrete elements and poured concrete elements, and then big windows in the roof above, and then side windows on the ground level. And the focus is always toward the arc wall, and you see the arc, which itself sort of flowers. It looks a bit like a calla lily in its design. It's been described in many different ways. This modular system or sort of tabernacle arrangement was not entirely original to Yamasaki. His contemporary Percival Goodman, who was a very prolific synagogue architect at the time, had just completed the Fairmont Temple outside of Cleveland, and it too is sort of a modular design that you can see here. And he was also designing North Suburban Synagogue just up the road, which is probably one of the reasons why North Shore didn't even consider him as the architect for their own building. The modular system was also, essential to modernism and the international style. And right in Chicago, so only a few miles away from Glencoe, Mies van der Rohe, the great modernist, was creating the campus for ITT, the former Armour Institute. And you can see a very a rigid type of gridded geometry and modular system in his buildings. This is Crown Hall, one of the buildings at the ITT campus. And you can see that Yamasaki is doing something very, very different. The synagogue has been described as a synagogue of light. There's a student at Wesleyan, whose name I'm forgetting, I'm sorry, who wrote a very good paper a number of years ago, titling it Synagogue of Light and Analyzing the Synagogue. And that's particularly true in this photograph by the famous architectural photographer Balthasar Korab, which is a night scene, but it's illuminated, and the lighting, the high contrast lighting that he chooses really emphasizes the brilliance of the space. It seems to glow. Curiously, about the same time, finished just before, the building was finished just before, and the stained glass window was installed, I think, while North Shore was being erected. This is the Chicago Loop Synagogue in downtown Chicago by Lobel, Schlossman, and Bennett, who were considered for the North Shore project. They built many synagogues in the Chicago area between the 1930s and the 1960s. But what I want to emphasize here is the stained glass window, which is called Let There Be Light. The irony is here that this synagogue is anything but light. It's really, really dark. It's an urban site with no windows on the sides, no skylights, and the only light is artificial, or it comes through this big stained glass, which is very, very dark. So a congregant here would say, wait, let there be light. Yes, give me light, give me light. Where at North Shore, there's lots of light. There's light that just floods the building, and it changes during the day. And as the sky is blue or the sky is gray, it changes the tone of the light in the sanctuary. There's also a lot of artificial light. This has been a big challenge to building managers over the decades. There are fluorescent lights that are in both the ceiling and in these arches on the side. Now there's a big renovation project going on right now, and these are all being changed to LED lights, and it's going to be much easier to change bulbs or to keep a kind of constant thread. So here's a view of the interior that I took last year, I think, when I was there. And you can see it was kind of a gray day. It was a winter day, but we're looking out these windows on the lower level, and we can see out to the grass and trees, and we see this tabernacle, not in the desert, but in this lush Lake Michigan landscape. Outside, we see some of these features that recall Gothic architecture, sort of a pointed arch, ogive arch, but it also looks like a upside down leaf, some kind of frond. So the natural and the architectural merge. There's also a portico that goes around it. And inside, we see the same features here. We're looking toward the entrance, and there's a big organ and an organ loft above. This is opposite the arc wall. Yamasaki did not employ what many contemporary architects were doing, moving walls that would open up into a large social hall so you could expand the space. There is a bit of a social hall on the other side, but some seat expansion could be included by filling in these platforms that he built along the sides, which is a unique development. So there are historical sources in Jewish and in Christian architecture that Yamasaki looked at. We have here the Altneuschel in Prague, which is a real Gothic synagogue from the 13th century, and you can compare that with Yamasaki's design. There's some, they're not siblings, but maybe they're distant cousins, or this is an ancestor of North Shore. And then if we look at Christian architecture, we see even more comparisons. This is the upper church at the Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi, also from the 13th century. And this was an early Italian Gothic structure with a lot of wall, and that's where the famous Life of St. Francis frescoes are. But importantly, it had very thin walls up above with big windows, so it's flooded with light. And you can see the series of Gothic vaults also seems to be referenced in Yamasaki's design. And then other cathedrals. This is Lincoln Cathedral. You see this even more powerfully. And then this is a comparison of the vaults at North Shore with the fan vaults, very famous fan vaults at the cathedral in Bath, England. Yamasaki was very well educated in architectural history. He would have known, I think, all of these examples and many more. He was willing to engage with history much more than the other modernists were. he didn't break with the past, but he embraced it and adapted it using new technologies, and also combining the rationalism of, say, a Gropius or a Mies van der Rohe with the expressionism of an architect like Mendelssohn or some of the Russians. So he was a unique and really brilliant designer. And I think that's one of the reasons that this building and some of his other ones still are very exciting to look at, because tastes change over time. People go back from wanting something very tight, rational, understandable, comprehensible, to something that is more dramatic, expressionist, Baroque, and spiritually exciting and mysterious. And his building, some of his buildings, this one in particular, I think combines both those elements. And here's a comparison with another Gothic synagogue. This one was torn down in the 16th century. It's from Regensburg, and we just get some kind of continuity in the design. And here is the Altneuschel interior for another comparison. Yamasaki said, the aesthetic totality of any beautiful thing, such as a lovely plant, is in its concept, its structure, its tiniest detail. And these natural elements, I think, are very apparent. When I saw these vaults, I thought, yes, flowers. I also thought of Art Nouveau designs, not just Gothic, but Art Nouveau. And I was thinking here of Tiffany lamps. These are some of the famous dragonfly lamps. And those wings recall, or I should say Yamasaki's vaults remind me of those wings. Whether he was thinking of this, I do not know. But he does talk about the flowers, and Tiffany certainly had these beautiful flower vases. And I think that's also part of the beautiful aesthetic in the synagogue. And this is the ark, and here's the calla lily. Here's one of these vases. So, you know, for me, the ornament, the delicacy of this ornament, even though the building is big and open, this delicacy and ornament comes through. Now, one of the important innovations here is the opening up of the wall to the landscape. A few architects had talked about this beforehand, and in the 60s, this became something that congregations began to seek. In the Middle Ages, rabbis said, no, 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 windows have to be high up. People shouldn't be distracted. You should only see the sky. And it was also for security purposes. You didn't want people breaking in through the windows. But here, the building is opened up to the landscape, and it creates a wonderful precedent. Many synagogues have done this since. Different seasons, we get different views and trees and different amounts of greenery. By comparison, this is a late 60s building that little known but wonderful building, Temple Sinai in Rochester, New York, by James Johnson. And I think this is the greenest synagogue because the greenery actually grows inside. But I'm not sure this could have happened without Yamasaki's North Shore. And the Jewish Center of the Hamptons also opens up to greenery in the 1980s. And just nearby up in Milwaukee, near Milwaukee is Philip Katz's Congregation Emmanuel, which opens to nature. And then just up the road from Glencoe in Evanston, Illinois, is the Reconstructionist Synagogue by Carol Ross Barney, where you go inside and the sanctuary is up in the treetops. So this is this kind of embracing nature begins, I think, at North Shore and then continues apace. Okay, so to wrap up, I just want to give you a little history of the congregation and show the building process. I'll go through these slides very quickly. But North Shore broke off from Temple Sinai because it was too far away to commute, even for Reformed Jews who drove to Shul. They didn't have to walk. And they built a new synagogue in the 20s in Glencoe. It was more or less a Byzantine-inspired building by Alfred Altschuler, who was a very noted Jewish architect and Chicago architect at the time. He was a member of the congregation. He's best known for, so this is the building, and he's best known for Temple Isaiah, which is now KAM Isaiah near Hyde Park, and it's still an active synagogue. It's right across the street from where the Obamas, I think they still live there. And it was inspired, just like Yamasaki was inspired by Gothic architecture, Altshuler was inspired by Byzantine architecture, and this is San Vitale in Ravenna and Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. So there's this tradition of looking backward for source material. They needed to expand, though, in the 50s, because Rabbi Siskin really was pushing the congregation, and a lot of suburbanization was attracting new congregants. Originally, Yamasaki, when he was commissioned, was going to build a building adjacent to the older structure, and they bought land to do that. And that was the design, and this was the design that circulated, that many architects knew, and was actually in a famous exhibition at the Jewish Museum in 1963, which you see here. And this model was shown, and the building was reviewed favorably in the press. But then, unexpectedly, the opportunity to buy a big 18-acre estate on Lake Michigan, the Stonehill Estate, came up, and it was decided to do that. Interestingly, this building that was torn down in order to make North Shore, was one of the first houses built by an early Chicago Jewish architect, David Adler. But this was purchased and demolished, here you see after the demolition, and then the building started to go up. And this is, the process is very interesting because it's poured concrete to create the framework. There are a series of 8 piers or 8 bays, and these are repeated. So the formwork was done, the concrete was poured for one, and then they would move it to the next. This is the process of building medieval cathedrals, which were built bay by bay. And you see this here, and it's a slow process. And then this is what looked like in 1962. This is a little bit later when all of them have been formed, and we get the vaults and the supports. And then you have to get the precast panels in. The precast panels were made elsewhere and brought to the site to be installed. This caused some delays in the process, because when one of these fell during the installation, it cracked, and Yamasaki saw that the interior supports, the steel reinforcement, was not what he had specified, and therefore it was necessary to make these all over again. That probably contributed to the cost overruns as well. But here you see the building nearing completion in 64. It's very gray, it's concrete. It's more like what we think of as a brutalist building. Brutalist not because it's violent, but because it's concrete brute, raw concrete. But what happens is that the design calls for the concrete to be polished and painted. And so we get a white, or today it's a little creamy color cover, which really makes the building shimmer and shine and almost float in this beautiful landscape. So I think that's where we want to end it. It's still an active congregation. This sanctuary, which people thought was getting to be too big for the congregation, and they have built another sanctuary, another building nearby, which doesn't have as much space. So when the congregation's smaller, and that's where they've been meeting. But during the pandemic, this congregation was able to stay open because the Yamasaki sanctuary is so big. There was no problem social distancing in this hall. So let me leave it here. It's a wonderful building to visit, and the congregation is a delight, and they'll welcome you, and they'll show you the sanctuary, and they'll also show you the other facilities. The adjacent building by Thomas Beebe, built in the 1980s, is also interesting in its own way. So this is just a few miles out of Chicago. Chicago's filled with wonderful Jewish places, but this one's special. And if you want to, if you're a lover of modern architecture, it is a landmark not to be missed. So thank you for joining me, and I'll see you again. And we'll continue our journeys through Jewish buildings, places, and spaces. This is Sam Gruber for CSP signing off.